With the Taliban's return to power, we all saw the horror images that came when Kabul fell, and the horror images actually just keep coming. First, the images of desperation with hundreds of Afghans running along the US military plane in Kabul airport, which we all saw, some of them even clinging to the moving US aircraft, to now. And even now, we keep getting those images of people selling their body parts, young daughters, and marriages so that they can get just a little bit to feed themselves. Globally, the prevalence rate for violence against women, which is the number of women who've experienced violence in their lives, is usually 30, 35, 40 at best, in that range. In Afghanistan, it's 87%. It's 87%. So if we are talking about setting priorities for women, addressing violence against women and gender-based violence, whether it comes from your partner or from Taliban or from any other source, I think becomes very important. The other important point is, which is a point of reflection for me, is that for me, up until now, women-headed households were always like an economic category. I mean, as an economist, you're trained to look at them as an economic category, which is more vulnerable than other households because they don't have that army of unpaid labor to support themselves. But now I realize that women-headed households, for them, it's a matter of life and death. It's a matter of survival. How do they go? How do they earn? How do they feed their families? For me now, women-headed households has meant something entirely different post 15th of August last year.
The Ministry of Women's Affairs has been dismantled and, adding insult to injury, replaced with a Ministry of Vice and Virtue. Except for healthcare workers and a few other isolated exemptions, Afghan women have been told that they cannot work and that they should stay at home. There is no timeline as to when they could come back to work. Thirdly, we all know already about the education issue. It has been well reported by the media, but basically any girls above 12 have been banned from going to school, while rigid gender segregation are in place at universities, making it really difficult for young women to pursue a meaningful higher education. Maybe one of the most worrying dimensions of the recent attack, onslaught on women's rights has been the forcible disappearance, detention, imprisonment, silencing of women who have been demanding their rights, whether right to food, right to work, freedom of expression and movement.
خبرنگاران در کنار اردوی ما و نظام ما اولین قربانی‌ها را میداد در طول این 2 دهه. ما اینا را ساده به دست نیاوردیم که بخوایم در این مقطع کنونی ما ساده دست بدیم. 2 دهه تلاش کردیم، زحمت کشیدیم، حق دسترسی به اطلاعات به وجود آوردیم و در حال حاضر افغانستان به نقطه کور رسانه‌ای تبدیل شده. ما دیگه دسترسی به هیچ نوع اطلاعاتی را نداریم. ما دسترسی به هیچ نوع خشونت علیه زن را نداریم. ما هیچ آماری از خودسوزی، خودکشی و قربانی زن در داخل افغانستان نداریم. اطلاعات بیرون از افغانستان درز نمی‌کنه از شرایط حقیقی و واقعی زنان در داخل افغانستان. ما نمی‌دانیم سر زنایی که در خانه‌های امن بودن چه اتفاق افتاد. ما نمی‌دانیم که زنایی را که به عنوان اسیر میگیرن با اینا چه رفتاری را میکنن و تمام معنا و حق دسترسی زنان و در کار و دسترسی به اطلاعات و حضور در رسانه و حفظ آزادی بیان اینا همه از بین برده و ما هیچ چیز نداریم.
Today, Afghan women have no space socially, economically, culturally, politically. They have lost their right to vote. They don't have a Ministry of Women's Affairs, as Agnes was saying. There is no Afghanistan Independent Human Rights Commission, which was looking into the human rights situation in Afghanistan, but also particularly into women's rights situation in Afghanistan. We don't have any system in place to respond to the needs of the women victims of domestic violence. You know, there used to be women shelters. There used to be systems in place where women, survivors of domestic violence were receiving space and they were receiving support and the legal support. They don't have that anymore. Women have lost their access to justice. We don't have lawyers. We don't have judges. We don't have a functional and moderate court system where women can actually access it. And then finally, girls above grade 12, they are not allowed to go to school.
we cannot afford to put in place means of pressure and sanctions that victimize more the women and the girls of Afghanistan. That is completely counterproductive. What does it mean practically? It means that funding for humanitarian purposes must be made accessible to humanitarian actors that have been vetted on the ground. There must be a functioning system so that financial transactions for humanitarian purposes are actually delivered to credible NGOs and international NGOs, including local women's rights organizations. There must be a way of providing international cash assistance to avoid greater vulnerability, hunger, and so on of Afghan people, and in particular of women and children. So, in other words, the tools at the disposal of the international community to put pressure on the Taliban must be modulated. I think it's really important because we should not think that August was a defining moment. Oh, it was, but we should not suggest that in August, suddenly the international community became powerless or did not know what to do or did not want to do. I think it started much earlier than that. It started with the way the military a strategy unfolded. It started with the way the government was supported without focus on the fight against impunity or insufficient focus on the fight against corruption. So there is a lot to be said about the role of the international community before the Taliban took over. And it's really important that we do not lose sight of that, because otherwise we're going to repeat the same mistakes over and over again.
بیشتر از 1 میلیون مهاجر داریم در کشور ایران که به هیچ چیزی دسترسی ندارن و تحصیل دسترسی ندارن.
I really hope that with all of you who are participating from different parts of the world, you will still talk about the situation of women and girls in Afghanistan. You will still support us in our advocacy and in our campaigning and in our mobilization that we are doing. We still need to talk about the situation of women and girls in Afghanistan because things has worsened. Things has not improved since 15 August last year. I think there's Afghanistan right now is missing a human rights monitoring mechanism. We unfortunately don't have that system in place, and that's where we are hopeful that with appointment of a special rapporteur to look at the situation, the human rights situation in Afghanistan, there will be an opportunity to engage. There will be an opportunity for systematic monitoring of the human rights violations in Afghanistan, particularly looking into women's rights and girls' rights.
The fight ahead for women's rights in Afghanistan is going to be a very tough one. It's going to be tough, it's going to be difficult, and it will require a great deal of our commitment and energy to balance out those external systemic forces which are not going to be working for the protection of women's rights. I think what is happening right now in Afghanistan is, to me, also very important. We are witnessing women and men as well standing up, protesting, marching, demonstrating an incredible courage, but also an incredible vision for the country. What they are telling the Taliban and the world is that there is an alternative to the Taliban. Yes, it's weak. Yes, it doesn't have the guns. but they are insisting that there is a different path, a different way of building the state of Afghanistan, the nation of Afghanistan. That, to me, is so important, so crucial. Because right now, I think within the international community, there is a feeling that the only option is the Taliban. And what those women's organizations, those women's in the street are saying is actually no. The Taliban may represent or not some part of Afghan society, but we too represent a vision for Afghanistan. We too have a role and a commitment to the state and to the nation of Afghanistan, and that is not what the Taliban wants to do.
You know, for a healthy society, you need to have an acceptable governance system. And Afghanistan has over 35 million population, and I think the fact that the international community will once again betray Afghan people and will do whatever they can do with the Taliban will be a big disaster, and I really hope that never happens. But having said that, you know, if there is an inclusive government where, you know, there are different groups or allowed to join work, to jointly work and to jointly address the current situation in Afghanistan, if there is respect to human rights, specifically to women's rights, who are half of the population, if there is accountability on the human rights violations that the Taliban are committing, especially in terms of the monitoring mechanism that is needed in Afghanistan, if as well as if international community is coming forward with a non-negotiable call on the Taliban, on women's rights, on human rights, I think that can be something that can be taken into consideration for discussion and seeing on how Afghanistan will move forward. Obviously, with the last 6 months or last 7 months, despite of the fact that the Taliban in the beginning came forward to international and national media making certain statements on women's rights and on human rights, and they actually failed to address them, from girls' education to women access to work, to freedom of expression, to allowing women to work jobs and to join their works and all those things. I think that's where there's a need for trust that the majority of population in Afghanistan need to have on this group, or whatsoever the future inclusive system in Afghanistan will look like, to make sure that people are happy with that system, that there is competence, that there is governance.
Regarding the recognition of the Taliban, it cannot be negotiated. I mean, the Taliban cannot be recognized right now, given, you know, or ever. In fact, we'll have to see unless really tangible steps have been taken to protect the right of women, to protect basic understanding of humanity. But we need to be prepared for the fact that the international community may not be united on that front anymore. We need to be prepared for the fact that Russia may recognize the Taliban as part of the new agenda that the President Putin appears to have in mind. We need to be prepared for the fact that China may recognize the Taliban, and it has certainly taken much more steps than others. And then what do we do? Because others will follow suit. I think we need to be prepared for all those eventuality, and that means engaging with governments that could be prepared to recognize such a government. So, or such a de facto. We need to build a realistic future for the country. We need to help bring that future to the forefront. and to make it a real competitive vision as compared to what Taliban is trying to do. And it is there. It is there. We just need to provide all the support that the Amnesty can leverage so that this new vision, this alternative vision, that realistic vision for a different Afghanistan is there at the forefront of policy making. And that we can do with the women of Afghanistan inside and outside.
طالب باید بپذیره زناره. زنان نیمی از جامعه افغانستان هستند و باید پذیرفته بشن در حق کار، در حق دسترسی به اطلاعات، در حضور پررنگشون در ادارات دولتی، در معارف و آموزش و پرورش و دانشگاه‌ها و از کسایی که در اینجا هستند به عنوان نماینده بعضی از نهادها و دولت‌ها در این پنل ما و در این جلسه ما. سکوت دولت‌ها و جامعه بین‌المللی برای زنای افغانستان، کودکای افغانستان و مردم افغانستان نابخشوده نیست.